Okay, let's start. 2 decades of involvement, trillions of dollars spent. And then, well, it all ended with this incredibly chaotic, rapid retreat.
Yeah, it was quite the spectacle. And the outcome in Kabul, a complete collapse.
Leading right back, almost immediately, to the very system that, this massive global effort spent 20 years and just unbelievable resources trying to dismantle.
It's a tragedy on a massive scale. It really is. And it forces you to ask some very hard questions about why. How did this happen? Was it inevitable?
Exactly. And the source material we're diving into today offers a really quite provocative answer, doesn't it?
It really does. Its central thesis is pretty stark. It argues the tragedy isn't just that democracy failed in Afghanistan.
Which is sort of the common understanding, right?
Right. But the source says the real tragedy is that the American version of democracy was imposed so rigidly, so completely, that a genuine Afghan democracy, one that might have actually worked because it grew from their own culture, their own local legitimacy. It was never even given a chance. It was never tried.
Never even tried. Okay, that's a powerful claim.
Yeah.
So let's unpack that. That's what this deep dive is all about today, right?
Absolutely. We need to dissect why the U.S. effort seems to have been so fundamentally flawed, at least according to these sources.
So we need to look at this alternative blueprint. The sources propose this idea of an Afghan democracy rooted in local ways.
Connect it all to that historical pattern, the whole graveyard of empires thing, the British, the Soviets.
Yeah, it's sobering history. So our mission then is to really get into the weeds of why the intervention model didn't work.
Looking at those flaws, the history, and understanding the difference between, genuine self-rule that grows from the ground up.
Versus a model that's just sort of, airlifted in, validated by foreigners?
Exactly. That distinction is key. And we have to start right where the sources insist we start, with language.
Language, how so?
Well, the source argues that a fundamental linguistic mistake, a cultural misunderstanding, really doomed the project from the outset.
Okay, what was the mistake?
Calling the various groups simply tribes. When the U.S. went in 2001, that label shaped everything.
How did tribes lead to failure? Seems like a simple word.
Well, tribes implies something primitive, maybe chaotic, fragmented, something that needs to be managed or, overcome by a modern centralized system.
Right, it frames the problem in a certain way.
Exactly. But the sources argue that's a massive oversimplification. They say Afghanistan isn't just a collection of tribes. It's a mosaic of small, ancient, proud, and distinct nations.
Distinct nations, that's a very different framing.
It is. And these nations, these communities, they have their own complex, often quite sophisticated federative social structures built up over centuries. They weren't just waiting to be organized by outsiders.
Okay, so if you go in thinking you're dealing with unruly tribes, when you're actually dealing with established, self-governing nations, that changes the entire approach, doesn't it?
It changes everything. Your strategy for governance, for security, for building legitimacy, it all shifts.
That initial failure of language, then, it wasn't just semantics. It became a failure of policy.
Precisely. You can't impose a top-down, one-size-fits-all system if you fundamentally misread the social fabric of the place.
And this mislabeling, the source suggests, kind of paved the way for the centralized model the U.S. favored. It justified ignoring the local structures.
That seems to be the argument. It made the wholesale import of a Western model seem like the only viable modernizing option.
Okay, let's dig into that imported model then. Section 1, the failed export and what self-rule actually means. If we accept this idea of distinct nations, their idea of legitimate power must be very different from, say, the Washington Consensus.
Absolutely different. And that gets to the core misunderstanding the source identifies about democracy itself.
Which is?
Well, democracy at its heart means self-rule, right? The people governing themselves. The mistake, according to the source, was that America confused self-rule with imposed rule.
Imposed rule, meaning?
Meaning they arrived with a prepackaged solution, a finished product. This is what democracy looks like. Here are the institutions. Here's the Constitution. Now implement it.
Rather than working with Afghans to figure out a system that resonated with their own customs, their own sense of consent.
Exactly. There was no real sense of co-creation. It was delivery, not development. Sovereignty in the U.S. model seemed to reside with the blueprints brought from Washington, not with the Afghan people themselves.
That phrase, imposed rule, really captures it. And it speaks to the specific structure they put in place, doesn't it? It wasn't an adaptation. The source calls it a wholesale export of the Western political template.
It absolutely was. Just think about what was dropped in. A powerful, highly centralized presidential system quite alien to Afghan traditions of local power.
Mm.
Institutions explicitly modeled on Western bureaucracies. National elections, crucially, where the legitimacy, the very certification, was overseen and bankrolled by foreigners.
The whole package just sort of plopped down.
Yeah, dropped onto this landscape that historically valued decentralization, local consensus, elder authority, jirgas, shuras. It just didn't fit.
So it sounds less like building democracy and more like trying to achieve ideological conformity. Make them look like us.
That's exactly the critique to the source levels. The focus was overwhelmingly on Western mimicry, on getting Afghanistan to look like a modern republic on paper.
Rather than focusing on what? Cultural authenticity.
Precisely. That desire for quick, measurable, externally validated results, it actually suffocated the potential for what the source calls an organic Afghan democracy.
Because real legitimacy there comes from different places.
It comes from local consent. It comes from historical precedent, from decisions made through culturally recognized means, like the local councils or shuras. When you bypass all that, you basically sever the political roots of the system you're trying to build.
And if you sever the roots, the tree can't stand on its own. The government becomes totally dependent on the foreign power that planted it.
That's the classic failure, isn't it? You don't build a self-sustaining nation, you create a dependent client state.
And that lack of genuine internal legitimacy is why it all crumbled the second the external support, the U.S. military and financial backing, disappeared.
That's the synthesis the source provides, yeah. The institutions lacked buy-in. They were seen, rightly or wrongly, as conduits for foreign aid and protection, not as expressions of Afghan sovereignty.
Their authority came from Washington, not from Kandahar or Herat or the Panjshir Valley.
Exactly. And that built-in dependency inevitably led to the rapid, total collapse we all watched happen.
Okay, so if that imported model was so fundamentally flawed, what was the alternative? This brings us to the core proposal in the source. The missed blueprint, the tribal federation. Or maybe we should call it the Federation of Distinct Nations.
Yes, let's use that framing. And this is where the source gets very specific, almost radical in its prescription. It argues the structure needed to mirror the reality on the ground.
Meaning a loose federation, something that respects all those different local power centers.
Exactly. Respecting ethnic and local political realities while still maintaining some kind of unified, but importantly limited, central state.
Let's break down that structure. How would it actually work? Because it sounds like a way to manage that diversity without imposing uniformity.
Well, the proposed model is deliberately layered, decentralized. It starts at the very local level.
Okay.
Each ethnic group or local nation would first elect its own leader. And crucially, they'd do it using their own traditional, culturally accepted methods, not necessarily a Western-style ballot box everywhere.
So the legitimacy is built in from the start. These leaders would have real grassroots support, unlike perhaps some figures promoted by the international community.
Precisely. That local leader has genuine authority because their own people chose them in a way they recognize. Only after that local process happens.
Then what?
Then those locally elected leaders would come together, perhaps in a grand council or lawyer jirga format, to participate in the election of a national president.
Okay, wait. That structure? It sounds oddly familiar. The source makes a connection here, right? A rather pointed one.
A very sharp, almost ironic comparison. It draws a parallel to the original intent of America's own electoral college.
Really? How so? Not the modern, often controversial electoral college, but the idea behind it.
Exactly. The original concept, the source argues, was this: a layered system designed to ensure that national unity, federal power, was only achieved after considering and synthesizing robust local consent and representation from the constituent states.
So the Afghan Federation model would have mirrored that, respecting local autonomy, the sovereignty of these distinct nations, while creating a mechanism for choosing a national leader acceptable to the whole confederation.
That's the idea. It's a way to build unity from the bottom up, respecting the parts while forming a whole.
So the central government in this model, it wouldn't be all-powerful like the one the U.S. tried to build.
Definitely not. It would be much more limited, maybe responsible for national defense, foreign policy, perhaps some major infrastructure projects that cross regional lines.
But the day-to-day stuff, law, order, schools.
That stays local.
Yeah.
The proposal demands sweeping local autonomy. Local councils, the shuras, the jirgas, they govern the things that matter most locally. Justice systems, maybe tailoring education curricula, and critically, local law enforcement.
So democracy gets defined locally as actual self-rule, validated by the community, not by a stamp from the UN or the US Embassy.
Exactly. That's local legitimacy in practice. And think about security. Those local militias, which were often a source of instability, they could have been brought into the system,
Yeah.
legitimized, transformed into official tribal or maybe nation police forces answering to the local council.
Okay, that addresses security and legitimacy head on. But it raises a really sensitive point, and the source has to tackle this. What about rights? Particularly, women's rights, minority rights, a system built entirely on local consensus in very conservative areas. It might not look very liberal initially.
That is the absolute crux of the difficulty, isn't it? And the source leans into this very directly, defending a path of patient, culturally sensitive reform.
How? What's the argument?
It acknowledges, quite frankly, that this proposed Afghan model might not have been liberal or gender equal at the start. It explicitly suggests women, for instance, might not have voted or participated fully in those initial local elections in some areas.
That's a hard thing for Western sensibilities to accept.
It is. But the core argument is this. A system built on genuine local consent, even if imperfect by external standards initially, is the only sustainable platform for future progress. Imposed rights, the argument goes, don't stick if the local culture rejects the imposition itself.
So how would that progress happen then, if not by external pressure?
Through internal evolution. The source argues that reform, when it comes slowly through things like education and local consensus, is ultimately more permanent. It becomes owned by the society itself.
And they draw a parallel back to Western history.
Yes, back to the U.S. itself. American democracy at its founding was deeply flawed. Right? Slavery, exclusion of women, property requirements for voting, massive contradictions. It took centuries of internal struggle, civil war, civil rights movements to get to where it is now, and it's still evolving.
So the mistake wasn't the goal of reform, but the method, demanding immediate, top-down, externally enforced perfection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Demanding that kind of ideological purity from the start, the source argues, only guaranteed resistance and rejection because it violated the fundamental principle of local self-rule, of cultural dignity.
Trying to force centuries of social change in, 5 or 10 years?
It leads to backlash. But if you establish a system based on local legitimacy, you empower local actors, reformers, educators, women's groups within that society to push for change over time, using arguments and methods that resonate locally. It might be slower, frustratingly slow sometimes, but the source believes it's the only way reforms actually take root and last, because they become their choices, not foreign mandates.
It's a challenging argument, especially when you see rights being violated now. But the source frames it as realism versus idealism, the only path to long-term stability and sustainable reform.
That seems to be the core calculation, yes. Stability first, through legitimacy, then reform through evolution.
Okay, this idea of working with the reality on the ground, even the difficult parts, leads us straight into maybe the most controversial aspect, the Taliban. The whole strategy for 2 decades was basically hunt them down, eradicate them. The source suggests something very different.
Radically different. Instead of eradication, the source proposes assimilation, integration.
Assimilation. The conventional wisdom was always, these are extremists, terrorists, proxies for foreign powers.
And the source doesn't necessarily dispute the extremism of their ideology, but it argues that politically and socially, the Taliban were also a local force, especially among rural Pashtuns. They had deep roots and, in many areas, significant local loyalty. By treating them purely as an external enemy to be hunted to extinction, the U.S. basically eliminated any chance of peeling off factions, integrating parts of the movement, or turning that local loyalty towards a new, legitimate Afghan state structure.
So, under this tribal federation model we've been discussing, how could that assimilation have actually worked on the ground? How do you bring insurgents into a system of self-rule?
Well, the sources suggest a pragmatic approach, focusing on security and local governance, tying into that decentralization theme.
Okay.
Instead of trying to project the weak, often distrusted, central government's army or police into every village.
Which often felt like an occupation itself.
Exactly. You could have potentially integrated elements of the Taliban, particularly local fighters, into transitional, decentralized security roles.
Like what? What kind of roles?
They could have served as local police forces, but, and this is key, responsible to the local council, the Shura, not to Kabul or foreign commanders.
Accountability stays local.
Right. Or they could have formed provincial guard units, maybe even national soldiers, but operating under traditional command structures respected locally.
So you're basically shifting their role from insurgents fighting the state to agents of local security responsible for order within their own communities under their own recognized leaders.
That's the concept. The goal, as the source puts it, was to have them potentially reconstituted as guardians of their own provinces under the rule of law.
But the rule of law here means the law decided by the local council, reflecting local norms, not necessarily the secular constitution imposed from Kabul.
That seems to be the implication, yes. It's about finding a structure that could provide security without occupation. This taps into that core sovereignty issue.
Because the moment foreign troops are patrolling the village, it becomes about resistance to the occupier.
It becomes a defense of the homeland, a spiritual and civilizational imperative for many. The failure to even explore a path like this assimilation model, the source argues, meant arrogance triumphed over wisdom.
Choosing the seemingly simpler path of military confrontation over the incredibly complex, messy work of political integration.
And perhaps, as we'll discuss later, choosing the more profitable path of endless war over a potentially quicker but less lucrative political settlement.
So the failure wasn't just military, it was a failure of political imagination. An inability to see the Taliban not just as an enemy to be killed, but as a political reality to be somehow managed, localized, and maybe neutralized by integrating them into a legitimate structure.
Exactly. By refusing any form of assimilation, the U.S. strategy inadvertently reinforced the Taliban's narrative. They remain the pure, uncompromised resistance against foreign domination.
Which meant when the foreigners left,
They simply stepped back into the vacuum, having never been functionally replaced or absorbed by the centralized system that lacked deep roots anyway.
this whole model, the federation, the assimilation, it sounds incredibly complex politically. Trying to get all these different factions, armed groups, local leaders, maybe even former enemies to agree on anything. Has anything like this ever worked? Did the sources offer any historical parallels?
They offer a couple of really interesting external comparisons, examples where unity emerged from internal dialogue and necessity, not from a foreign blueprint.
Okay, what's the first one?
Surprisingly, perhaps, the founding of modern Israel.
Israel. How does that relate to Afghanistan? Seems worlds apart.
Well, think about the situation before the State of Israel was formally declared in 1948. Palestine, under the British mandate, was, as the source puts it, a volatile patchwork of armed groups.
You mean the Jewish paramilitary organization?
Exactly. The Haganah, the more radical Irgun, the even smaller Lehi group. These weren't unified forces. They had different leaders, different ideologies, sometimes conflicting agendas, and they often clashed violently with each other, as well as with the British and Arab groups.
Okay, so a lot of internal division and armed factions.
Right. And the key point the source makes is that unity wasn't imposed by the departing British or some international committee. It was forged internally.
How?
Through intense struggle, yes, but also through crucial negotiations among the leaders of these competing militias. Necessity, the looming threat after the British left, forced them to find common ground, leading eventually to their consolidation into the single Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF.
Ah, so the parallel is that Afghanistan's various tribal, militias, ethnic forces, maybe even integrated Taliban units could have theoretically followed a similar path, brought under some kind of confederated banner.
Yes, with unity growing organically from necessity and dialogue, hammered out between the Afghan actors themselves.
A unity forged from within, which arguably would be much stronger and more resilient than one supervised and paid for by outsiders.
That internal legitimacy, achieved through difficult compromise, is the critical difference. It carries the weight of shared struggle and agreement. Foreign-imposed unity, the source implies, is inherently fragile. It devolves when the supervisor leaves.
Okay, that's a fascinating comparison. What was the second one?
The second is a direct contrast in approach within Afghanistan itself, comparing Washington's heavy-handedness with New Delhi's more subtle diplomacy.
India's role in Afghanistan. How is their approach different?
According to the sources, Indian diplomats engaged with Afghan officials very differently. They treated them as equals, not as, pupils of democracy who needed constant instruction.
Less condescension, more respect.
Exactly. There wasn't this constant attempt to micromanage their institutions or dictate policy. Instead, India focused its investments on projects that clearly benefited Afghans and recognized their dignity and desire for self-determination.
Like what kind of projects?
Building crucial infrastructure like roads, the Zaranj-Delaram Highway is a key example. Supporting education. Strengthening deep historical cultural ties. things that build capacity and foster goodwill.
So, unlike the perhaps perception of some U.S. contracts, these weren't primarily about enriching foreign consultants or creating dependency.
That's the distinction the source draws. India's investment aimed to enhance Afghan capacity and sovereignty. The result wasn't the kind of dependency the U.S. model fostered through massive security-focused spending.
The result was trust.
Trust. India built relationships based on mutual respect, shared interests, and tangible investments in the Afghan future. It really highlights the difference between a diplomatic approach that listens and respects and an imperial one that tends to lecture and control.
Okay, so if this alternative model, the federation of distinct nations, assimilation, learning from history, if it had so much potential logic, why was it ignored? Why did the U.S. stick so rigidly to the flawed top-down model? This brings us to the uncomfortable part. The arrogance of empire and, well, money.
Yeah, this is where the source shifts focus from political miscalculation to, frankly, economic incentives and institutional inertia.
Why was the better model ignored? The source is pretty blunt about it.
Brutally blunt. The answer it provides is stark. A slow, organic democracy does not feed the military-industrial complex.
Oof. That's cynical, but it cuts deep, doesn't it? The idea that the political model that might have actually worked for Afghans
Was financially inconvenient for the massive foreign apparatus involved in the intervention.
because local control, slow consensus, gradual change, it doesn't generate billions in contracts.
Precisely. It
Yeah.
cuts out the middlemen. The source really details the economics of this perpetual intervention cycle.
How so?
It argues that empowering local communities to rebuild slowly, using their own methods, maybe with modest targeted aid, that's slow and unprofitable from the perspective of large contractors and bureaucracies.
Right. Not many billable hours in letting a village council manage its own affairs.
Exactly. What is profitable, the source argues, is the cycle of destruction followed by large-scale, externally managed reconstruction. It explicitly states that wiping the slate clean and rebuilding with contracts, security services, and foreign consultants is infinitely more lucrative.
Creating a need, then selling the solution. A very expensive solution.
And the source gives concrete, if generalized, examples. For every destroyed village, there was a new, often larger contract for rebuilding or security or governance advice.
And for every new ministry or constitution created in Kabul,
You needed a dozen American advisors who billed their hours at astronomical rates. The system incentivized complexity, centralization, and dependency, because that's where the money flowed.
so the very structure of the intervention, the way the money worked, actively discouraged the development of genuine Afghan self-rule.
It created a powerful inertia favoring the status quo, the illusion of progress on paper, the creation of detailed, billable plans and reports, even as the reality on the ground remained fragile or worsened outside the green zone.
And when the central government you've created has no real local legitimacy, it constantly needs propping up, which means
More contracts. For security, for training, for advising, it becomes a self-perpetuating financial machine.
a machine that maybe didn't want local capacity to succeed too quickly.
The source certainly implies that. Why foster a truly independent, self-sufficient Afghan police force if you can pay private contractors vastly more for services that also keep the dependency cycle going?
It points to a fundamental arrogance within the system, the belief that legitimacy could be engineered.
Yes, that the Pentagon, the State Department, the intelligence agencies believe they could somehow engineer legitimacy through enough money, technology, and advisors. They mistook building dependency for building democracy.
And the cost. We have to keep coming back to the staggering cost.
Trillions of dollars across Afghanistan and Iraq, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, an immense expenditure of resources.
All chasing this illusion, fueled, according to the source, by this combination of arrogance and the economics of the military-industrial complex.
And in pursuing that, the source argues, the U.S. forgot something fundamental. It forgot how to listen.
So busy projecting power, dictating terms.
That they became deaf to the actual political realities, the historical warnings, the cultural nuances of the place they were trying to remake.
Because the true test of power, the source says, it's not about shouting the loudest.
No. The true test of civilization, it suggests, is how deeply it listens. And by failing that test, by failing to listen, America didn't just lose a war.
It lost.
It lost the moral clarity that once defined its mission, or at least its self-perception. Principle got sacrificed on the altar of profit and perceived geopolitical necessity.
This failure to listen, to learn, It seems even more stark when you zoom out and look at the long history here. Which brings us to the source's second major theme, Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires. This wasn't the first time a global power stumbled badly in those mountains.
Not by a long shot. It's a pattern repeated over 2 centuries. The source argues this history should have been the ultimate flashing red warning light.
A warning that was apparently ignored.
Willfully ignored, perhaps. This land has been, as the source puts it, the undoing of empires again and again. It proves that overwhelming military might often means very little against a determined population fighting on home turf they refuse to yield.
Let's start with the British. Peak of their power, 19th century. They learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible.
Oh, absolutely brutal. We have to recall the details of the First Anglo-Afghan War, specifically the retreat from Kabul in 1842. It's just catastrophic.
Tell us about it. The scale is hard to comprehend.
The entire British garrison, something like 4,500 soldiers, but also 12,000 camp followers, families, staff, tried to retreat through the winter snows to Jalalabad. They were relentlessly attacked by Afghan forces the entire way, frozen, starving, ambushed in the high passes. The source emphasizes the near-total annihilation. Only one European man, Assistant Surgeon William Bryden, managed to stagger into Jalalabad on a dying pony.
One survivor out of 16,000 people. That's that image alone.
It's the ultimate symbol of imperial hubris crashing against Afghan reality, and the world's mightiest empire at the time completely decimated.
And the reasons for that failure sound familiar.
Eerily familiar. Underestimating local resistance, misunderstanding the politics, trying to impose a puppet ruler, Shah Shuja, who lacked legitimacy, ignoring the terrain and the climate. The British tried again later, of course, but they never truly subdued the country. The lesson was written in blood, but apparently not read carefully enough by the next superpower.
Because jump forward about 140 years, and the Soviets make the same mistake. 1979, they roll in, convince their ideology, their modern army, will succeed where the Tsars and the British failed.
They came in confident, didn't they? With tanks, helicopter gunships, a belief in the inevitable march of socialism, and they walked right into a 10-year nightmare.
The war against the Mujahideen.
A brutal, grinding conflict against fighters armed initially with not much more than, as the source says, faith, rifles, and terrain, and maybe some outside help later on, but the core resistance was indigenous.
And the impact on the Soviet Union itself.
Devastating. The source argues the war in Afghanistan was a key factor in the USSR's decline and eventual collapse. It drained the treasury, shattered the morale of the Red Army, created widespread disillusionment back home. The Soviet Empire quite literally bled out in those mountains.
Another superpower humbled. Lesson learned? Apparently not.
Because then came the 21st century. The Americans arrived post 9/11. Unprecedented technology, drones, satellites, precision weapons, night vision, massive funding.
Surely this time would be different.
That was the belief, that technology and resources could finally overcome the historical pattern, that they would be the exception.
And yet,
after 20 years, trillions spent, the longest war in U.S. history. The result was the same: humiliation, a chaotic retreat, the return of the Taliban. The pattern held.
British, Soviets, Americans, 3 global powers in 2 centuries.
All met the same fate in Afghanistan, the source concludes. Humiliation, retreat, and defeat. The graveyard, it seems, is remarkably consistent.
So, beyond the specific historical failures and the difficult geography, what is it about the Afghan spirit, the Afghan people, that makes this resistance so enduring? The source calls it spiritual and civilizational. What does that mean?
It means the resistance isn't just about politics or ideology in the Western sense. It's deeper. It's fundamentally about sovereignty, but a sovereignty rooted in their identity, their land, their faith, their ancestral ways.
So it's not like they're fighting for communism or for liberal democracy.
No, they're fighting against being ruled by outsiders, anyone not from their soil imposing foreign ways. Their loyalty is intensely local, fiercely independent. It's tied to their honor, their clan, their valley. It's not easily transferable to an abstract nation-state imposed from Kabul, let alone by foreigners. This concept of independence for them is just non-negotiable.
That intense localism and fierce independence, it connects to another really interesting idea in the source: the paradox of the unsophisticated. How does seeming simplicity become a strategic advantage?
This is where invaders consistently misjudge them, the source argues. Foreign powers see the lack of modern infrastructure, the resistance to consumer culture, the adherence to old traditions, and they mistake it for backwardness, weakness.
But it's not weakness.
The source says, in this context, that simplicity is actually purity of purpose. It translates into incredible resilience.
How so?
Well, think about it. Afghans, particularly in rural areas, measure power differently. It's not about GDP or technological gadgets. It's about endurance. It's about honor. It's about loyalty to your community. They live close to the land. They're accustomed to hardship. It's often a daily reality.
So they're just tougher, harder to break.
In a fundamental way, yes.
Oh.
The source makes a sharp contrast. The modern soldier relies on complex supply chains, air conditioning, connectivity, regular meals, morale boosters. Comfort becomes a vulnerability.
While for the Afghan villager,
Hardship is just life. It's their baseline. The source says his hardship is his armor. They have less to lose materially, perhaps, but everything to gain by defending their way of life.
which means foreign armies have fewer levers to pull.
Exactly. What can you offer them is a temptation. Consumer goods they might not value. What can you threaten them with? Hardship they already know intimately. The source argues that when life is already a constant struggle for survival, foreign armies can offer neither sufficient temptation nor sufficient terror to truly break their collective will.
They just outlast the invaders. Their time frame is different.
Absolutely. Which brings us back to geography and patience. The terrain itself reinforces this resilience.
How does geography become destiny here?
Empires are good at conquering flatlands, rivers, cities, places you can control from central points, places where logistics work easily. They are terrible at conquering mountains like Afghanistan's.
Why?
Because, as the source vividly puts it, in the mountains, every ridge hides a sniper, every village is a fortress, and every family is a history of resistance. The geography itself mandates decentralization. It prevents easy control, it favors the defender who knows the land.
And the final weapon, the ultimate advantage.
Patience. Afghanistan defeats empires, the source argues, through patience. It calls patience the longest weapon of all.
Explain that.
Invaders operate on political timelines, election cycles, budget years, quarterly reports. 4 years, maybe 8, maybe 20 in the U.S. case seems like a long time to them.
But for Afghans?
They count in generations. They've seen empires come and go. Their attachment is to the land, to their ancestors, to a rhythm of life much longer than any occupation. They are willing, fundamentally, to wait out any foreign power.
Because they know the invader will eventually leave.
History tells them so. And the core truth, the source concludes, is incredibly simple yet consistently forgotten by invaders. You cannot occupy a people who do not consent to be ruled.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together. This deep dive has covered a lot of ground. The core failure, according to the source, it was twofold.
That seems right. First, an institutional failure. A failure to design or even seriously consider a political system that tribal federation or federation of distinct nations that actually fit the cultural and political reality of Afghanistan.
Ignoring a viable blueprint that respected local legitimacy.
Yes. And second, a massive historical failure. A failure to learn the crystal clear lessons from 2 centuries of previous imperial adventures in the exact same place. The British, the Soviets, the warnings were all there.
And underpinning both failures was this: arrogance, this belief in the universal applicability of the Western model, perhaps amplified by the financial incentives of the intervention industry.
That's the argument. The arrogance of empire, choosing the familiar, profitable, top-down approach over the difficult, patient, decentralized partnership that might have worked. They ended up building dependency, not democracy.
And paid an enormous price, not just money and lives, but also, the source argues, in moral standing globally.
Yeah, the source suggests Afghanistan isn't just a graveyard, it's also a mirror. It reflects the folly of that arrogance back at the powers who try to dominate it.
And the ultimate lesson:
That a people who love their soil, their independence, more than an invading empire, fears defeat. They always hold the ultimate advantage. It's a matter of will and time.
which leads us to that really powerful final thought from the source material. Do you want to share it?
Sure, it concludes. In the end, it is not Afghanistan that falls. It is the illusion of control. And that, more than any bullet or bomb, is what kills empires.
The illusion of control, that's haunting.
It really is. And it leads you, the listener, with a crucial question to ponder, doesn't it? As we look around the world today, at other seemingly intractable conflicts, other places where immense power and resources are being expended.
Where else is that same illusion of control blinding policymakers? Where else are we failing to listen, failing to understand the deep currents of history and local legitimacy?
That, perhaps, is the most vital and most humbling lesson Afghanistan continues to teach the world.